Kristin Neff, thank you so much for joining the World Happiness Agora. As you know, we are trying to unite the world by happiness, and having somebody like you who basically created kind of the operational framework around self-compassion is just spectacular. Thank you so much.
Oh, you're welcome. You're welcome. Yeah. So let me talk a little bit about how I got interested in self-compassion, my journey here. It's really my life's work at this point. So first of all, I did not come up with the idea. I wish I could claim credit, but I actually learned about self-compassion in a mindfulness meditation group. I was under a lot of stress. It was my last year of graduate school. And so I thought I'd learn some meditation to help me deal with my stress. And lucky for me, the woman leading the meditation group, the very first night I went, talked about the importance of self-compassion. Really talked about how we need to be kind and supportive and warm with ourselves the way we would be for a friend, especially when we're struggling. And so, I was under a lot of stress, and I tried it out. I wasn't a particularly harsh self-critic, but I wasn't particularly kind to myself either. I was just kind of neutral. And so I actually started trying to be proactively warm and supportive, giving myself kindness, and being understanding with myself. And I was really amazed at the huge difference it made in my life in terms of my ability to cope with stress and some things that were going on in my personal life. So I got my first job after getting my PhD is I did 2 years of postdoctoral study with a woman named Susan Harter, who was one of the country's leading self-esteem researchers. And so I started learning more about self-esteem and about the fact that, maybe it wasn't all it was cracked up to be. So what we know about self-esteem is it's very good for psychological well-being. People who have high self-esteem are less depressed, they're less anxious, they're less stressed than people who hate themselves, right? So in many ways, self-esteem is kind of considered this pinnacle of psychological health. We want to have high self-esteem as opposed to low self-esteem. If we judge ourselves negatively, that leads to all problems. But what psychologists were finding out is that, yes, it's nice to have high self-esteem, but there are healthy and unhealthy ways to get it. In fact, what we're realizing is many of the ways we try to get high self-esteem, many of the ways we try to feel good about ourselves are actually not very healthy. So, one of the baseline problems with self-esteem is that, at least in American culture, to have self-esteem, you have to be above average. You have to be special and above average, right? And that's a problem because it's logically impossible for everyone to be above average at the same time. Think about that. If someone calls you average, you feel bad about yourself, and yet by definition, we are all average. So that kind of sets up, one of the first problems with self-esteem is we're always trying to feel better than others. And one of the ways we have to do that then to manage this desire to be above average is we start comparing ourselves to others. Is she prettier than me? Is he smarter than me? Is he more popular than me? Whatever the type of comparison is. And that social comparison actually leads to a lot of problems. For instance, we know, why do early adolescents start to bully other kids? Why do they start to pick on other kids? With boys, it tends to be more physical bullying. With girls, it's called relational aggression, kind of like saying nasty things about the other girls in school. Well, it's really driven by the desire for high self-esteem. You don't have much to go on when you're an early adolescent. So one of the ways kids get higher self-esteem is by feeling, I'm bigger than you, I'm better than you, I'm cooler than you, whatever it is. And that means putting people down so you can feel better about yourself. So that's a problem for adolescents, but it doesn't end in adolescence. If you look at adults, we still have a lot of this going on. Prejudice, for instance, okay? Now, granted, prejudice is a complex phenomenon, power and social structures are all in there. So I don't want to reduce it to the need for self-esteem, but certainly some element of the desire to feel that, my racial group, my ethnic group, my gender group, whatever group, my in-group is better than your out-group. Part of that is driven by the need for self-esteem, to feel like special, that we're better than other people, right? So we certainly know the problems that causes. Narcissism is another product of self-esteem. Many kids who were told by, well-meaning parents and teachers, you're great, you're special, you can do it. They kind of grew up feeling entitled. And some researchers, actually Jean Twenge and Keith Campbell, they're two researchers who've been tracking the self-esteem of college undergraduates in the US for like 20 years. And they kept on going up and up and up. Not the self-esteem, the narcissism, right? Directly driven by the higher self-esteem. So if you have to be special and above average, and that actually means being narcissistic, that's a real problem, okay? So, and some people argue that there's an epidemic of narcissism in our society today, partly because of this need for high self-esteem. Another really big problem with self-esteem, from my point of view, is that it's contingent, right? So in other words, we invest our self-esteem in certain domains of life, and if we succeed in those domains, we feel good about ourselves. So actually the three most important domains in which most people invest their self-esteem are physical appearance, right? Competence, that you're good at sports or school, whatever it is important for you to be competent at, and popularity, our perception of what other people think of us. And by the way, it's not what your mother and your best friends think of you. They don't count. It's like what other people at work, or what my peers in my field, or, what other kids in school, what they think of me. And first of all, that's a problem, because you don't really know what they think of you, and they don't know you very well. So that's a lousy source of information. Attractiveness, that's difficult, especially for women, I have to say, because women generally think they're less attractive than men, which I'm sorry, I don't think is true. But what the problem is, the societal standards of beauty are much higher for women than they are for men. So right about, fourth or fifth grade, you start getting women concerned with body image, not thinking they're attractive enough, and their self-esteem takes a nosedive because, that's an important source of self-worth. Whereas, boys also like to feel attractive, but they tend to think they look pretty good, right? Because the societal pressures aren't as strong. And so there's, huge amounts of strife caused, especially adolescent girls, because of this need to look a certain way. So that's a problem. The biggest problem, however, is the fact that it's contingent in the first place. In other words, we feel good about ourselves when we're popular, when we have a good hair day, and when we're succeeding. So, someone like us or professors, when we get that manuscript accepted, we feel good. But what happens when you get it rejected? What happens when you fail? What happens when you're having a bad hair day? Or whatever it is, precisely when we need our self-esteem most, and that's when we're, feeling bad about ourselves, we fail, we make a mistake, our self-esteem deserts us. Because, if we fail, it lowers our self-esteem. So you might say self-esteem is a fair weather friend, right? It's there for us when times are good, but when we really need it, when times are not so good, it tends to desert us. And actually some researchers are arguing that even more important than how high your self-esteem is how stable is your sense of self-worth, right? So in other words, does it go up and down all the time? Is it really kind of destabilizing? Or some people argue it's better to have kind of a medium sense of self-esteem that's stable, because you can kind of adjust around it. It's the devil as opposed to these highs and lows. So, I was researching in my postdoc that I might say the downsides of self-esteem, that I was practicing self-compassion in my personal life. And I realized that from my point of view, self-compassion was such a good alternative to self-esteem. Because what does compassion mean? It means kind of, being kind to yourself when you're suffering. So, you don't have to be special and above average to have high self-compassion. You just have to be a flawed, imperfect human being like everyone else. I can do that, right? And so we know from the research, for instance, that the sense of self-worth linked to self-compassion is much more stable over time. It's much less conditional because it just comes from being a flawed human being like everyone else. So anyways, what happened was I got a job at the University of Texas at Austin, and I decided I wanted to research self-esteem. So the first thing I had to do was clearly define what I meant. I mean, yeah, it makes sense being a good friend to yourself, but it's hard to look at that in research, right? So I had to clearly define what self-compassion was, and then I created a scale to measure it, so I could kind of start doing research on it. And so, Because from my point of view, self-compassion isn't really different than compassion for others. In other words, it's easier to give to others than ourselves, but the experience of compassion is kind of the same. Actually try to think of, what goes into the experience of compassion for others, and then kind of extrapolate that to what goes into self-compassion. So if you think about it, really the first thing that has to happen when you have compassion for someone is you have to notice them, right? Like, think about maybe homeless people by the side of the road, or people in your, environment who are struggling. If you don't even notice their suffering, you can't have compassion for them. And the thing is, though, we don't like to notice suffering because it hurts. It feels bad. So we'd rather kind of tune it out and just pretend that homeless person on the side of the road isn't there, right? In order to have compassion, we need to be willing to turn toward suffering, even though everything's going, I don't want to do this. We need to be brave enough to be open to suffering and to acknowledge that it's there. And then, right, we have to have a kind response, because you might notice, a homeless person on the side of the road and that they're a bad way, but you may judge them. That's probably their fault. That's not compassionate. Compassionate is kind of being concerned. Are they okay? Are they getting the services they need? And so, I realized that because I've been studying mindfulness. I realized that mindfulness is at the very core of compassion and self-compassion. Being willing to turn toward kindness and warmth was really essential. But what really, I didn't know this right away, but as I was thinking about it, certainly in the Buddhist literature, a lot of teachers talk about the fact that the near enemy of compassion is pity. Pity and compassion, they're near enemies because on the surface, they may look kind of similar, but they're really, really drastically different underneath. And, think about it. We like it when people give us compassion. We do not like it when people pity us. So what's the difference between compassion and pity? Well, with pity, there's like a separation, looking down on someone. We don't like it when some people feel sorry for us. The compassion is, oh yeah, that's human. That, that could be me. It's like this kind of an equality, a shared nature of the suffering. And so I realized that in order to have compassion, we have to acknowledge our common humanity, kind of our interdependence. We aren't alone. We're all in this together. We're all vulnerable. And then, so when when you aim that to self-compassion, all those same elements are there from my point of view. So, we need to be mindful of our suffering. And, again, we'd rather not be mindful of our suffering if we could get away with it. Either we're just in problem-solving mode, like let's say if you get a health diagnosis that's upsetting, the very first thing you do is you get on the internet and you try to figure out what doctors can I see, what medicine can I do, how do I fix the problem? That's natural, but we don't pause. Like if your friend said, oh, I just got this health diagnosis, your first reaction would be, oh, I'm so sorry. How hard for you. That must be so upsetting. We don't do that with ourselves. We go straight into problem-solving mode. So in order to have self-compassion, we have to acknowledge, I'm really struggling right now. And the nice thing about mindfulness is it kind of encourages some perspective taking. Instead of being lost in the suffering, like being carried away by it, we kind of step outside of ourselves and say, wow, I'm having a really hard time. And that gives a little space so that we aren't so lost in the pain. And that little bit of space is, from the mindfulness world, gives us that chance to respond rather than react. So we need to be mindful of our own pain, kind of, we don't avoid things, but we don't run away with them. We're just kind of with it in a more autonomous manner. And then we need to be kind to ourselves, and it's interesting because most people from the research are much kinder to other people than they are to themselves. We say things to ourselves that we wouldn't even say to our worst enemies, most likely, unless we were really bad. We say things like, I'm such a loser, I'll never amount to anything, I'm so ashamed of myself. You wouldn't say that to a friend, not if you were to keep your friends, right? So there's a real discrepancy between the kindness we show to ourselves and others. So self-compassion, when we notice we're suffering, and even when that suffering is because I made a mistake or I failed at something or, I gained 20 pounds or whatever it is, the idea is we respond with warmth as opposed to harsh self-judgment. But then really key for self-compassion, what keeps it from being self-pity or just feeling sorry for yourself is remembering common humanity, right? So self-compassion, it actually isn't a self-focused state at all. Some people think it is because the S word is there, self-compassion. You can just call it inner compassion if you want. We direct compassion inward and we direct it outward, right? We remember that we are a flawed human being who makes mistakes, who's imperfect, like every other human being. And, you know, it sounds reasonable and logical, and we actually do know this logically, but what happens, especially when we fail or we make a mistake or something really difficult happens, kind of illogically, we feel as if something has gone wrong. You know, this is not supposed to be happening. I'm not supposed to fail. I'm not supposed to get this health diagnosis. I'm not supposed to have this really difficult thing happen to me, you know, but well, why not? I mean, that's what it means to be human. That happens all the time. That's human does not mean perfect. To be human means imperfect. You know, everyone fails. Everyone makes mistakes. Everyone has struggles. That's actually what unites us, not what separates us. And so with self-compassion, when we remember that nothing has gone wrong, it is normal to be imperfect, then we actually really help ourselves. We feel connected in our suffering. Whereas when you feel all alone in your suffering, you know, you're kind of like adding insult to injury. Not only are things really painful, I feel all alone in my pain, and that feeling of isolation makes things that much worse. So that's kind of how I came up with the model that self-compassion entails 3 core elements, right? Mindfulness as opposed to over-identification, running away with your difficulties, kindness as opposed to harsh self-judgment, and then a feeling of common humanity as opposed to feeling isolated by your difficulties. A real pause for breath there.
It's just listening is so much wisdom, and I've been fortunate to go through your training. And how do we actually get from this wisdom, which is more rational, into the embodiment of these 3 elements? How do you train people to be more mindful, more kindness, and actually sharing their suffering?
Right, yeah, and that's what's so important, is that these are trainable skills. I mean, I think it's important to kind of understand what we're talking about, but it's really not a matter of the head, it's a matter of the heart. Luckily, I mean, I must say one of the things I've been surprised about is this, it's easier to teach people how to be self-compassionate than I realized it was going to be. And that's because the skill of self-compassion is part of our human nature, right? Most of us, we grow up, we've learned how to be a good friend. You know, as human beings, as mammals, we have what's called the caregiving system. I mean, what makes mammals different than reptiles is, like, you know, reptile mommies have to lay their eggs and there's no connection, there's no bond, you know, they might eat some of the eggs or whatever, that the babies are ready to go. But because we're mammals, and especially human beings, we actually have the longest developmental period of any other mammal, 25 years for the prefrontal cortex to finish developing, right? And that we have a long period of plasticity and kind of immaturity so we can adapt to the environment. But what that meant is, for human beings especially, we had to develop a system, a caregiving system, that would motivate the infant to want to be taken care of by the parents, and it would motivate the parents to want to take care of the infant, right? Very important. You know, it's related to attachment and all those things many people probably know about. But the good thing about this is that we are built to care. We are born to care. Huge portions of the real estate of our brain are designed to care. So, for instance, 2 very key triggers of the compassion response, and we know this is actually in all animals, but humans all around the world, one is touch, right? Just think about it. When a baby is born, there's no way to communicate love and care and safety with the parent other than touch. So the touch is an exquisite communicator of care. So that's why, you know, just teaching someone when they're upset to put your hand on your heart, or cradle your face, or hold your hand, or, you know, some sort of touch, you actually give a signal to your body at a pre-verbal level that you're safe and you're cared for. And it can be remarkably effective. And, you know, it seems almost too simple, but it's not, because, you know, it's like millions of years of evolution behind its effects, and it, you know, reduces cortisol and sympathetic nervous reactivity. So that's one thing you can do is touch. Another key signal of the care response is tone of voice. So again, think about it. Baby comes out of the womb, they don't have language yet. They don't understand the content of what's being said, but they understand by the tone, the kind of soothing, caring tone that a parent communicates to their child, right? And again, it's not just humans. Think about like dogs or cats and that kind of, oh, they found there's a universal sound of compassion. It's kind of that little up and then down at the end. Oh, oh. And so you can use your tone of voice just by paying attention to your tone of voice. Is it a warm, caring tone of voice, or is it like a harsh, demanding tone of voice, right? And so that's another thing that we can draw on. And that's just the baseline, nonverbal cues. And then we can add in, the content. So for instance, we usually know what to say to a good friend when they're upset, they're feeling bad about themselves. We usually know how to be supportive, how to be encouraging, maybe some criticism is necessary, but constructive, kind, as opposed to like belittling and shaming. Most of us have learned how to do it for others. And therefore we just have to turn that skill toward ourselves. And I know some people are thinking, well, these skills aren't equally distributed, and it is true. So for instance, if you're caregivers, we're supposed to make you feel, warm and safe and cared for, didn't, maybe they're abusive, it's going to be harder for you to have self-compassion. You're naturally going to have lower levels of it because it wasn't modeled for you. But the really exciting thing is that what we know is with a good therapist, and in some ways what therapy is modeling this compassionate relationship between the client and the therapist that then the client then internalizes. They learn how to meet their own needs. You're kind of like reparenting yourself. Maybe your parents didn't give it to you, but you actually can learn to do it for yourself. And you can change your brain. You can even change your adult attachment schema through self-compassion practice. So, it is a practice. You can't just snap your fingers. It's not like you just understand it and you've got it. You have to practice it. But there are practices that you can do, and they're actually pretty simple. I must say, meditation is definitely a very good way to learn anything, to train your brain. But for people who don't meditate, we find that just doing things in daily life, like, oh, sorry, sweetie, that must be so hard. Say it to yourself, or some kind of kind words. It's really as effective as like doing 20 minutes of loving kindness meditation every day. There's a lot more pathways in. I think because it's just kind of a core part of being human.
So do you foresee a world with more self-compassion?
Yeah, it's already happening, right? So when I started back in 2003, the word wasn't even really out there, even in the Buddhist literature. People talked about including yourself in the circle of compassion. So the concept was there. And then, of course, humanistic psychologists talked about self-acceptance. So these ideas were out there. But I think because there's now like a clear term for it, and the research, I think that's really the big driver. There's so much research showing, it's not going to do the things we're afraid it's going to do. It's not going to make you lazy or self-indulgent or avoid responsibility or, slack off and, undermine your motivation. All those myths we have about it, research shows actually it's exactly the opposite. And so I think because of that, there's more widespread acceptance of it. There's a lot more media attention paid toward self-compassion, and it's just kind of entered the common parlance in a way that wasn't the case even 10 years ago. And I do have to say a lot of that is because of the mindfulness movement, right? So mindfulness and self-compassion, we like to call them best friends forever, like they kind of go hand in hand. They're not exactly the same. Mindfulness more is acceptance of present moment experience. Self-compassion is more kindness and acceptance of the experiencer. So it's a little more relational, a little more personal. But the two, they go hand in hand, they overlap quite a bit. And so I think what's happened is as mindfulness has gone mainstream and, they teach it in sports teams and the UK Parliament and, in businesses and healthcare companies, as mindfulness has gotten more mainstream, it's kind of opened the door for self-compassion as, self-compassion needs to accompany mindfulness. And any mindfulness practitioner or teacher will tell you that, and actually when you're fully mindful and there's no resistance, it kind of just naturally arises. But what we're finding is that it helps to make it explicit. sometimes it arises, but sometimes it doesn't. So it helps to give people little tools, little practices, like phrases they can use, or touch, or, some way to kind of explicitly, consciously bring in the warmth. Because if you're just mindful, you just have a lot of equanimity, but there's no warmth there, then it's only half the picture. And so I think the two together, practice together, are really powerful, and that's why we're seeing these huge changes because of it.
So, well, thank you so much. I think that it was so clear, self-esteem, self-compassion, how we practice it, and how mindfulness in this case is helping to open the door, but we need to go deeper. I think that your contribution is just spectacular, and we are so honored to learn from you and to practice with you, and let's spread this message to as many people as possible, because we need this, and we know how impactful it is. So thank you so much, Kristin, for being part of the Agora.
You're welcome. Have a wonderful conference.
Thank you.